I now, Chair, pass over to Mr. Tarzib, who has a small amount of adducing of evidence to take place prior to the commencement of closing submissions. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, we seek your permission to adduce a series of statements relating to the Christian congregation of the Jehovah's Witnesses, including statements from elders and from parents concerning the handling of child sexual abuse within the congregation. With your permission, Chair, I'll just run through what those statements are. There's a statement from PRH6, for which the reference is CJW 30107. There's a statement from PRH7, for which the reference is CJW 30108. A statement from PRH9, with reference CJW 30109. A statement from PRH10 and PRH11, with reference CJW 30110. A statement from PRH12, with the reference CJW 30111. A statement from PRH13, with reference CJW 30112. And then 3 statements from elders. The first is from Francis Kakakota, with reference CJW 117. A statement from Philip Snellman, with reference CJW 30121, and a statement from Daniel Butler, with reference CJW 30119. Chair, we also seek your permission to adduce statements from PRX1 and PRX2, who are former members of the congregation, as well as PRX3, who remains a member. All 3 of these individuals describe their experiences within the congregation, and in particular in relation to the practices and policies regarding the handling of child sexual abuse. The references for those statements, Chair, are PRX1 is PRX 508. For the statement of PRX2 is PRX 4027. And in the case of the statement of PRX3 is PRX 4030. Thank you, Chair.
We'll now proceed to hear closing statements by those core participants who've indicated they wish to make such a statement. Each core participant team has been given 5 minutes, except for Mr. Scorer, who's been given 15 minutes. And we will begin with Mr. Scorer. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and panel. To confirm for those watching, I represent Migdal Emunah, Southall Black Sisters, Sadia Hamid, Lloyd Evans, Dr. Lisa Oakley, Yasmin Raymond, and the Interfaith Alliance. Chair, as we noted at the outset, this investigation is one of the first to be undertaken worldwide into child sexual abuse in minority religious settings. You've started, therefore, a long overdue process of scrutiny. But for reasons that were all too apparent during the hearings, your investigation can only be a beginning. You've lifted the lid and started to examine the reality of child sexual abuse in these settings. But in so doing, you've merely confirmed the extent of work still to be done and the legal and structural overhaul now required. I start with the evidence on Jewish communities. You heard from Yehudis Gold-Sobel of Migdal Emunah. She made many powerful points. She told you about the central role of rabbis in Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities. Whatever their formal religious jurisdiction, the reality is that rabbis are involved in all aspects of the life of their communities, including response to child abuse. Indeed, this was confirmed by Rabbi Baumgarten, although, of course, he tried to make a convenient exception for the rabbi in the dispatches program. Reality is that rabbis are never off duty, but therein lies the problem. Rabbis are experts in religion. They are not experts in safeguarding. As Ms. Gold-Sobel explained, their aim is to protect the face of the community as a collective whole, not to protect the individual who might have been abused. The rabbi's focus is the community and its reputation, not the needs of the victim. As we've seen throughout this hearing, what religious organizations, both Jewish and others, often fail to understand is that dealing with child abuse is a special skill. It is not simply another aspect of the pastoral role of a rabbi, an imam, or a priest, and it requires an overriding focus on the child, not on the reputation of the synagogue, the mosque, or the wider community. It also requires specialist training and experience. As Rabbi Baumgarten confirmed, none of the UOHC rabbis are even DBS checked, let alone trained in safeguarding. Yet so much of the day-to-day life in Jewish communities, particularly Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, focuses on the role of the rabbi in dealing with these issues. Disappointingly, in this hearing, we didn't get an opportunity to hear from Shamar Kohli. By claiming that Mr. Rabson is no longer active, despite evidence suggesting otherwise, they managed to evade scrutiny. However, the central role of rabbis in Jewish society is very evident if you look at their website, which shows that they seek rabbinical approval for their activities at every turn. This is the cultural reality you have to deal with, and any recommendations you make have to have it well in mind. And you also have to have well in mind what was very apparent from Rabbi Baumgarten's evidence. In ultra-Orthodox communities, which are by far the fastest growing Jewish communities in the UK, with half the community under the age of 18, the very fact of child abuse itself is constantly minimised and denied by religious leaders. Ms. Goldsobel raised another important issue, disguised compliance. This is where organisations and settings seek to give the impression of effective safeguarding because they know that wider society and inquiries like yours demand it, but the reality on the ground is one of half-hearted or non-existent implementation. Of course, this is not only an issue in Jewish settings, and I remind you of Mrs. Justice Leven's devastating comment about child protection policies in the Jehovah's Witnesses being drawn up for public consumption but not followed. As far as Jewish settings are concerned, in our written submissions, we'll set out in detail our concerns about the training from Reshet and Interlink and the implications for the quality of training in Jewish communities at the current time. A similar picture emerges in South Asian communities. When you heard from Pragna Patel, Sadia Hamid and Natasha Ratu, you rightly observed that they painted a rather bleak picture. That is because sadly the reality is quite bleak, and this is the reality they deal with every day. Their analysis of power, silence and denial within South Asian communities was confirmed, perhaps unintentionally, by other witnesses you heard from in this sector. The Mosques and Imams Advisory Board, MINAB, have set themselves up as an improvement body to make mosques better. But over the past 2 decades, they have completely failed to perform any meaningful regulatory or other improvement function at all in relation to child abuse. Their attitude is that there is nothing to see here. They tried to wriggle out of questioning on this by saying that they are led by what they get reports on. Nobody reported a problem to them, so they didn't do anything. But actually, it was clear that MINAB simply do not see child sexual abuse as an issue within the Muslim community at all. And Chair, it may be that if you went back 20 years, that level of ignorance could be to some extent excused. However, since 2011, child sexual abuse has been in the news almost constantly. This is why we have this inquiry. This national conversation has included issues around child sexual abuse associated with parts of the Muslim community, grooming gangs, for example. And you heard yesterday the very impressive evidence from the Muslim Women's Network. And as they said, they did a report in 2013 on these very issues. So the idea that this is not an issue within Muslim communities is absurd and dangerous, but this is the attitude you have to deal with from the main regulatory body for mosques. What was very apparent from the MINAB evidence was not only their lack of understanding of child sexual abuse, but frankly their lack of understanding of their own ignorance. Mr. Azmi said that Islam sees sexual abuse as one of the worst types of sin, that Muslims understand this, and so basically this is the end of the matter. He refused to accept expert training from secular organisations. He claimed it wouldn't be culturally appropriate. So he wants to say that Muslim organisations have a good understanding of sexual abuse, but at the same time that the training offered by secular bodies is not culturally appropriate because it involves explicit discussion of the things that he claims are already well understood. He wants to have it both ways. As the evidence shows, this is also true of Hindu and Sikh religious bodies. We heard, for example, about the safeguarding failings at the largest Hindu temple in Leicester and how the Sikh Gurdwara in Southall refused to refer vulnerable women and children to local women's groups. And this is the level of denial and complicity confronting victim advocates like Pragna Patel and Sadia Hamid in their everyday work. I turn to the Jehovah's Witnesses. As we'll set out in our written submissions, we feel that much of the evidence from Mr. Gillies was evasive and misleading. In the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, he tried to tell you that the Jehovah's Witnesses don't have any arrangements or activities which separate children from their parents, whether in field service or Bible study or elsewhere. And he used this obvious untruth to justify rejecting any secular advice on safeguarding. He claimed that no witness had ever been required to appear before their abuser in a judicial committee, whilst knowing perfectly well that a recommendation from a religious authority figure always carries a degree of compulsion, particularly in a religion which ostracizes those who fail to comply with its practices and beliefs. His attitude to external reporting was very striking. On everything else, including whether to report damage to a kingdom hall, his organisation is very directive. But on this issue, his view was that each shall carry his own load. It was notable just how many pretexts the Jehovah's Witnesses will find not to report abuse or to disclose documents, and we heard more about that obstructionism this morning. The only reasonable conclusion from this litany of excuses is that they simply do not want to report. Mr. Gillies was also very discomforted, quite clearly, by Mr. Frank's questions about document destruction. Chair, given that so much of Mr. Gillies' evidence was so obviously disingenuous and unreliable, we take this final opportunity to urge you to use your powers to compel full disclosure of their records and data in regard to abuse allegations, rather than the selective data disclosed thus far. Child sexual abuse is abuse whether it is perpetrated by an elder or an ordinary member of the congregation, whether in a kingdom hall or in a home. By permitting CCJW to present their data so selectively, we are concerned that hundreds, if not thousands, of abuse cases were effectively excluded from consideration. The many victims whose abuse is currently confined to Watchtower's records, especially those whose abuse is yet to be reported, remain completely silenced. And Chair, if you fail to seek disclosure of the full data, you unwittingly make things worse for survivors than if you had sought no data at all. Cherry-picked figures, which the Jehovah's Witnesses repeatedly and wrongly characterised as the full figures during this hearing, will, we fear in future, be touted by them as the actual figures, and they will try to say that they have your stamp of approval. Indeed, Chair, the same point applies to data from other religious organisations. If you don't require full disclosure, some of them will say that you approved the data that they provided, and your lack of challenge will be presented as validation. Chair, in highlighting these issues in religious organisations, we do not seek to deny improvement and good practice where it occurs. On the contrary, given the right regulatory structure, good practice can be a role model for others. We commend the evidence from the Baptist Union and their efforts to improve safeguarding practice, but also to develop the right culture to underpin it. And this is consistent with the experience of Dr. Lisa Oakley, who identifies the Baptist Union as one of the organisations which is set out to develop and promote a healthy culture. Similarly, in her work with the United Reformed Church, Dr. Oakley found that her recommendations were acted upon quickly and transparently. These positive examples should be recognised, as should other recent changes. For example, we welcome the recent public announcement from Manchester Beth Din that it is halakhically permitted for victims to report their abuse to the police, and that it encourages them to do so. However, it is important to see recent improvement in context. It has mostly occurred because of pressure from this inquiry and campaigning groups. The Manchester Beth Din letter came about because of years of tireless campaigning from Migdal Emunah. And these improvements cannot detract from the overall reality seen in these hearings. Religious settings are woefully under-regulated, as indeed Ms. Scolding QC observed. Many religious settings are less regulated than donkey sanctuaries. Self-regulation has very largely failed. So the overall picture is troubling, very troubling, and we have the constant risk of what Ms. Gold-Sobel aptly calls disguised compliance. It is clear, therefore, that in order to properly protect children in religious settings, we need a new approach. We clearly need registration of religious activities and personnel, not to interfere with the free practice of religion, but because without it, meaningful regulation of any kind is clearly impossible. We need to widen the definition of regulated activities. We also emphatically need mandatory reporting. If the case for mandatory reporting still needed to be made, it was made in spades by the evidence you heard about the Jehovah's Witnesses and from Rabbi Baumgarten. As was clear this morning, without mandatory reporting, other regulatory powers and actions are effectively neutered or undermined. But in relation to mandatory reporting, I would also like to emphasise this point. Mandatory reporting is sometimes portrayed as a stick which the law uses to enforce compliance. But we should view it in a much more positive light, which is that a mandatory reporting law provides a refuge for those within regulated activities who often face fierce pressures not to report, pressures of loyalty to colleagues, to community, and to the institution. Mandatory reporting gives people the ability to say, I have to do this. And in that way, it enables them to escape the pressures against reporting that we've seen so many times in this inquiry. Chair, we also need an entirely new model of independent oversight of safeguarding in these organisations and settings. The current situation exposed in these hearings is a collective failure, not just of religious organisations themselves, but of all the agencies charged with child safeguarding and indeed the law itself. So we need a new system. As I've said before, we're not suggesting that an external body should do the safeguarding in these settings. Safeguarding has to be done, it has to be owned by the organisations themselves. But monitoring the effectiveness of safeguarding, ensuring that it meets the necessary standards, and dealing with complaints. For that, we need an independent oversight body. And I finish just by making 2 points on that. Firstly, current bodies simply do not have the resources, knowledge, or legal tools to do the job properly. That is clear. By its own admission, as we heard a few moments ago, the Charities Commission cannot do it. A stronger case might be made for local authorities to do it, but the danger there, the real danger, is then a balkanised system where national standards lose out to a localised postcode lottery. So we need a new national body. Furthermore, a key issue for our clients is to ensure that any such body is not captured by the very interests which it seeks to regulate, but is instead driven by child protection and human rights values and principles. For that reason, it is imperative that victims and survivors and those who advocate for them are fully involved in the work of any new body. The meaningful involvement of victims and survivors in a new regulatory system is the best guarantee that the failings seen in these hearings are avoided in the future. Chair, those are our submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scorer. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. I speak on behalf of Exjw advocates opposing crimes against children. Their submission is this: that Exjw advocates opposing crimes against children was formed to shine a spotlight on the crime of child sexual abuse in the context of the Jehovah Witnesses. The group feels that the hearings on Monday and Tuesday this week helped it to achieve this, and so all in, the group are grateful to the inquiry for providing them with a voice. The hearings concerning the Jehovah Witnesses fully demonstrated why a mandatory reporting law for England and Wales is vital, and why a new external regulatory body should be formed with the power to ensure organisations meet best practices with regard to child-centred safeguarding. There is, the group feels, an intransigence on the part of the Jehovah Witness organisation, a failure to embrace its institutional responsibilities, its duty of care, its duty to protect children, both its own and those outside its religion. During the hearings, counsel to the investigation repeatedly put forward meaningful suggestions of where the Jehovah Witnesses could improve in child protection. Not once did Paul Gillies of the Jehovah Witnesses take her suggestions seriously. We might consider such and such on a case-by-case basis, being the pinnacle of his enthusiasm. The group notes too a rigid mindset in respect of apologising for child sexual abuse. Mr. Gillies was asked if his religion's policies made provision for apologising for child sexual abuse where there is institutional fault. His answer was no. The group asks, how can any organisation move forward willingly in child-focused safeguarding if it cannot conceive of the need to apologise for its failings? In view of the foregoing, therefore, Exjw advocates opposing crimes against children makes the following recommendations to this inquiry. First of all, mandatory reporting. There should be a mandatory reporting law that requires all allegations of child sexual abuse to be reported by religious and non-religious institutions to the police or a child protection body. The legal obligation should extend to all those with any position of trust without exception. Moreover, persons in religious ministry should not be exempted from reporting their knowledge or suspicions, formed in whole or in part of information disclosed in or in connection with both religious confession, and so-called confidential contexts. It should be a criminal offence not to report. It is important that both religious bodies and the individuals within them who hold positions of trust understand the need to report allegations. Mandatory reporting places the onus on the individual to report to the police. However, the religious organisation or institution must also have a legal and moral duty to report. It should report to an external regulator, and that mechanism should form an integral part of its child protection policy. There should be sanctions, whether criminal or civil, for failing to do this. There should be an external regulator. There should be a national regulator for child protection. It would be an independent body with oversight of the institution's policies, procedures, and practices relating to child protection. The role of the regulator would be A, to ensure institutions' policies and procedures are child-focused and fit for purpose. B, to educate and support institutions in forming and implementing fit-for-purpose child protection policies and practices. C, to investigate institutional failings in child protection. D, to impose meaningful sanctions on institutions where non-compliance arises or adequate standards of child protection are not met. It is the opinion of this group that these recommendations would, if implemented, not curtail religious freedom, since this is not about infringing on personal belief, nor is it asking any religion, such as the Jehovah Witnesses, to change its belief system. What we are proposing, with regard to any remedial action that needs to be taken against a religious organisation, amounts to no more than the state intervening in religious procedures and practices, where it can clearly be demonstrated that the protection of children has been compromised. Children's right to be free from child sexual abuse is paramount here. It supersedes the rights of any religion to impose outmoded and ineffective methods of child protection. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, panel, and we welcome the opportunity to present a written submission over the coming weeks. Thank you.
Mr. Brady.
Chair and panel, well-informed recommendations depend on reliable facts. Of course, facts are not supposition, they're not innuendo, and certainly not stereotypes. And in this, I'd like to just pause. It's submitted that Mr. Scorer's comments about destruction of child sexual abuse records is patently false. Facts, of course, have to correspond to the scope of this investigation, which counsel to the inquiry has said in her opening submissions is to examine how religious organizations in England and Wales in 2020 respond to the need to keep children safe. Well, Chair, with that in mind, I would like to address the facts as they relate to two key questions concerning the child protection policy of Jehovah's Witnesses. The first question, does that policy in 2020 respond to the need to keep children safe and to act appropriately to allegations of child sexual abuse? CCJW submits that the answer is yes. Mr. Gillies explained that the child protection policy of Jehovah's Witnesses was substantially revised in the middle of 2018 through to the early part of 2019, and now comprises 4 core documents. What are the facts before you about the 2018-2019 child protection policy? Well, throughout the 2 days of this hearing that were devoted to Jehovah's Witnesses, the counsel to the inquiry presented a total of 7 cases. But what are the facts about those cases? 3 of those cases are about how elders are said to have responded to allegations 30 or more years ago. That's the case of PRA 39, PRA 5, and PRA 40. 2 other cases are about how elders are said to have responded to allegations in 2008 and 2012. That's found at tabs 29 and 53 of the evidence bundle. Well, that leaves 2 remaining cases, the Lancashire judgment and the case of PRA 42. And the latter was first brought to the attention of the elders in 2019. If I could underscore, the facts of the Lancashire case occurred in 2016 before the current policy was adopted. So that leaves the case of PRA 42. And CCJW submits that that case demonstrates that the policy, the current policy of Jehovah's Witnesses, was carefully followed. The only issue in that case involved the timing of the elder's disclosure of a confession to the police. You might recall that the evidence demonstrated or showed that there was a 7-month delay in obtaining a production order because of the police officer. That delay wasn't attributable to the elders at all. And I encourage you, Chair, to look at the statement of Mr. Ruby Dobson. CCJW presented to the inquiry 13 witness statements from victims, parents, and elders. Now, 5 of those statements relate to how elders respond to allegations in 2014 to 2017, just before the current policy came into force. 5 statements relate to 2019 after that policy came into force, and 3 are from 2020, just a few months ago. The counsel to the inquiry did not refer to any of those 13 witness statements, although in CCJW submissions, they are the only evidence before you that provides the facts about the current policy of Jehovah's Witnesses, what this inquiry is examining or looking at. So, Chair and panel, I encourage you to carefully consider those 13 witness statements when reaching your factual conclusions about the current child safeguarding policy of Jehovah's Witnesses. CCJW submits that those witness statements confirm that the policy is working. Allegations where a child might be at risk of abuse are being reported by the elders to the police. Victims are being supported by the elders, and parents are being warned by elders. And that brings me briefly to the second question. What does the child protection policy of Jehovah's Witnesses, or why does it rather, not require that all allegations, including non-recent allegations, be reported to the statutory authorities? Well, the simple answer is this. In the absence of a mandatory reporting law in England and Wales, the Britain branch office had 3 choices. Number 1, do nothing. Number 2, report every allegation to the police, including non-recent allegations. Or number 3, report allegations where it appears that a child might be in danger of abuse. In the absence of a mandatory reporting law, the branch office, Jehovah's Witnesses, have chosen number 3. And in jurisdictions that have adopted a mandatory reporting law, some of those jurisdictions, if not many, require 2 things. First, they require that individuals with the knowledge of the allegation, the individual, is the one who should make the report. Of course, that individual is free to seek legal or other advice, for example, from a supervisor, a union, or a professional body. And secondly, those jurisdictions require that the duty to report is limited to allegations where an identified child might be at risk of abuse. Now, there's no special training required to make that assessment. And an example of that type of mandatory reporting law is the Canadian province of Ontario. Well, the test that the Britain branch office uses to decide what allegations to report, as set out in paragraph 8 of the branch office service desk guidelines, is essentially the same. The facts, based on evidence and not based on speculation, show that the current child protection policy of Jehovah's Witnesses, as applied now, is safeguarding children appropriately. But Chair, may I assure you that Jehovah's Witnesses keep the child protection policy under review, and they will carefully consider any and all recommendations that this inquiry makes. Thank you.